The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
Another series of Bring Back V10s is coming to a close, and if we were going to get through every question submitted during this series that we're yet to answer, we'd need to squeeze in about 100 in this final episode. Thank you so much to everyone who left us a question about the V10 era of F1, either by using the hashtag BringBackV10s on Twitter or through leaving us a 5-star podcast review. When we did this in our first series, I think we had about 10 questions left over by the end, and now a year later we have 10 times that, which is just incredible. We love all the interaction that we get from you about the show, and for the break before our next series, I do have a question for you. So, dear audience, would you like us to start including stories from F1's V8 era in our future series? We've done one special episode of Bring Back V8s before kicking off Series 3, and we received a lot of questions for that. So if you'd like us to expand our era to tell some more stories from 2006 to 2013 as well in the future, let us know in the off-season using the hashtag BringBackV10s. But let's get back to the end of Series 3 and focusing on 1989 to 2005, as we always do. Joining me, Glenn Freeman, for another rummage through the best of your latest questions are Ed Straw and Matt Beer. Now, Ed, your approach to these questions from our audience tends to be the more obscure the better. So of the ones we've picked out for today, which one are you most looking forward to?
Well, there is one that might allow me to reference Larousse, which I always enjoy, but anything that lets me talk about Onyx, there's one that I can talk about Onyx in, or Andrea Moda, AGS, Fon Metal. None of those last three are actually topics I can talk about, but I just wanted to get them in just to give them a mention. And I'm maybe hoping that perhaps somebody's asked about Naoki Hattori's 2-event stint for Cologne at the end of 91 as a late submission.
Okay, well, I'm sure we'll get that in the next series now that you've done that. But I love the idea that you think that you need an excuse to talk about Larousse. You've managed to bring them up in pretty much every episode. And everyone marking their bingo cards for Ed Straw Rubbish Team Bingo. Most of you have probably got a full house already. Matt, welcome back. Which one have you got your eye on in particular?
That's one that took me by surprise. It's about comparing some particular teammates. And since you threw the questions out, I've been pondering it. I haven't got an answer yet because I sway about 20 times over which one I'd pick. It's question 3 on the script, so I've probably got about 5 minutes to make my mind up. And I might just toss a coin if I've got one to hand between now and that question happening.
Just go with whichever way the wind's blowing when we finally get to that question. But before we start the questions, we'll do our final review shout-outs of the series. Thank you so much to everyone who has left us a review, and sorry if we didn't get around to calling your name out over the course of the series. But our latest thank yous go to Ross T555, Tom1988, Pramer26, SK4 Tech, and DS Gore. And even if I haven't read out your name, I promise I have been reading all of the reviews, and they are greatly appreciated. But let's get going. Because, Matt, you can have the first question, which is from Cactus Jack. Bang, bang. And he says, if Damon Hill stayed at Williams in 1997, would Jacques Villeneuve have won the title that year? So if you want to get to that third question, Matt, answer carefully here.
No, he wouldn't. Sorry. I am quite a Jacques Villeneuve fan, but I think his 97 driving was actually one of his weaker seasons, particularly compared to how magical he looked for much of 1996. I think the pressure of expectation in 97, once he wasn't a rookie anymore and Williams was looking to him, did get to him. The fact that Ferrari was becoming stronger opposition as well did play into his head a little bit. So I think in a situation where he didn't have the kind of grace of being a rookie anymore and he had to actually winning regularly for Williams, he was always going to be a bit more flaky in 97, and having a kind of very uncertain fish out of water Frentzen as his teammate gave him a bit of a free pass there, whereas a much more established Damon Hill would have been significantly tougher opposition. And I also think Damon Hill going into 97, having won the 96 title, would have solved so many doubts in his head about his own potential, about his relationship with Frank Williams and Patrick Head as well. If Williams had decided not to sack Hill and kept him into 97, that could have changed all these things we've talked about in Damon Hill episodes before, about how he was looking for kind of fatherly guidance from the team and not getting it. So we would have seen a different Damon Hill up against the same Jacques Villeneuve, and that same Jacques Villeneuve wouldn't have been good enough at that point to topple that better version of Hill.
Okay, well, thanks for coming, Matt. That is the end of your appearance on the podcast. I think, and I'm trying to look at this dispassionately, which is impossible. I think Villeneuve would have got the edge over Hill that season, but I still think Damon being there would probably mean Villeneuve wouldn't win the title because they take points off each other. So that would work in Schumacher's favour. I think it would have been the classic Williams problem, wouldn't it? The one we've seen so many times before. Two top drivers taking points off of each other. I almost wonder if it would have helped Villeneuve's kind of focus and drive that year if there had been Damon to aim at in the other car. But I feel really bad. Like Damon Hill, we talk about Damon Hill so often, but so many of the most interesting stories about him that we've covered so far have been the kind of negative ones that Damon's been so honest about in reflection, and that's what makes them so interesting. So I feel that we owe Damon a positive episode about himself in the future. And what better way to start than with Matt giving him the 1997 world title. But let's move on to a question from one of our reviewers, Shark Hello, who asks, why didn't McLaren pinch the Mugen-Honda engine for 1993? So Ed, 93 was obviously when McLaren were fishing around for an engine when Honda itself pulled out. Mugen-Honda were on the grid by this point. Shark Hello asks, wouldn't it have just made sense to take that?
I just don't see it would have appealed to McLaren as an option or been workable from a Honda perspective, because remember that Mugen-Honda engine that Footwork used in 92 and 93 was a gentle development of the V10s that McLaren had last used in 1990 before they went to the V12 engine. So Mugen had been brought in to service the pseudo work supply that Tyrrell had, which was the old V10s, and then they continued it. It was independently funded, but with some Honda expertise. So McLaren wouldn't want to go to a several-year-old engine that they once had, and Honda wouldn't want to be seen to be continuing when it was kind of had this sort of low-key involvement through Mugen. McLaren knew they needed a works engine. Honda was never going to be that option. Certainly not until 23 years later or whatever it was when they got Honda back with hilarious consequences. So Ford was actually quite a good option because it was a decent engine. There was the possibility, which I'm sure was in Ron Dennis's mind, that they might be able to steal the works deal from Ford. And indeed, they did get works status parity, if you see what I mean, in terms of the engine specs. That was a shrewd move. And of course, McLaren got their works partner. It's just a shame it was Peugeot. But the Mugen engine in 93 would have been less competitive and just a dead end.
Yeah, I agree. It was just ancient technology by that point, as far as McLaren were concerned. We'll move on to question 3 that Matt's already mentioned. So we'll give Matt a little bit more time to work out his answer. We'll come to you first, Ed. The question is from Richard Warner, who quite simply says, Berger or Alesi?
It depends. It's the same with Matt. It depends on what particular time of the day it is, because they actually add up to fairly similar drivers. Both very good at times, both prone to falling asleep, both probably didn't fulfill
we all fall asleep, Ed, ideally once a day.
Yeah, but we try not to do it during the middle stint of a Grand Prix. And if you look at their time together, it's a sample set of 5 seasons across 2 teams, which is extremely unusual for drivers to have that length of time together, let alone across 2 teams. The stats aren't that different. 151 points to Alesi, 132 to Berger, 42 to 35 to Alesi in qualifying, 1 win for Alesi, 2 wins for Berger. They add up to a similar sort of thing. They're both frustrating drivers, and I think they're kind of symptomatic of a time when what was expected of a Formula One driver evolved quite quickly. Obviously, the Schumacher influence and the arrival of sprint races, etc. So it depends what you like, really. No question at the time I'd have said Alesi. No question at all. But actually, that was based upon the unfulfilled potential and the bad luck. But actually, I kind of increasingly realised that there was some certain weaknesses in Alesi that counted against him. But Berger had them as well. ideally, pre-Imola 89 accident, Berger would be my choice, but that doesn't really work for this. So I think it depends. It depends which one you prefer. What you don't do is take both of them, which I think is a point Pat Simmons made about Benetton. That was a big mistake. But I feel like with Berger, when things were really right, you got a really good level of performance. With Alesi, it was a little bit more random as to when you got that good performance. So I feel like if you put Berger in a car that could win the race, generally he'd make a good fist of it if he was on form. Whereas Alesi, you just never know. We talked about Nürburgring 95 before. I think that was a race he should have won, really. So maybe by a millimetre Berger takes it, but they add up to very, very similar options.
So while Ed was going through his lengthy and well-researched answer, I just did my usual Bring Back V10s thing of going, what did I think when I was 14, 15? And on that basis, it's Berger, because I just found Alesi so frustrating. I mean, obviously, the answer to Berger or Alesi is Schumacher, because that's what every team that ran that pairing realised was the better option. But yeah, Alesi's peaks were so incredibly high. Like the first half of Nürburgring 95, or the drive on slicks and the wet at Suzuka that year after his penalty, was just like nobody else in the field could have done that. But there were also days where you think a backmarking pay driver wouldn't done what Alesi's just done. It is the variation in performance was just so great. And I think Ed used the word random to describe Alesi's best days. And that was it, really. If it was a slightly damp Grand Prix, you could put some money on him starring then. But really, you never knew what you were going to get. You knew what was possibly in there, and it was just extraordinary. But it appeared 2 or 3 times a year, and you certainly can't build a championship challenge on that. And if you're a front-running F1 team, you can't be signing that. I think Berger, before his Imola crash and before the experience of going up against Senna and realising kind of where he really stood in the world, if you take that kind of wrestling a turbocharged Benetton BMW around on a qualifying lap era Berger, that was pretty special too. So yeah, definitely Berger, with the caveat that Alesi had higher potential, but he used it about 5 times in his career.
Yeah, it's Berger for me, and I didn't get quite as many fence-sitting splinters as either of you two before coming to that conclusion. He won more races. I think he was more reliable, and I think in a way Alesi was great in 95, but I think he was flattered by 2 things that year. One was how good that Ferrari was. John Barnard, who designed it, is convinced that Schumacher could have won a world championship in it. But also I think Alesi was flattered by a lack of opposition in 95. Ferrari had a great car. Benetton had Johnny Herbert in the second car, who was having a rocky season where he wasn't always that happy. McLaren were rubbish. There wasn't really anyone else there. So Alesi's peaks stood out more that year. You had the Williams drivers. By the second half of the year, we know Damon Hill was all at sea mentally. So again, that opened a gap for someone else to appear as kind of almost the heir to the throne versus Schumacher. And yeah, I just think Alesi was so much unfulfilled potential in the end. And I think that frustration leans me towards Berger, where you probably did have a better idea of what you were going to get.
You mentioned 95 there, which is an interesting case, because I thought the same as you. Oh yeah, Alesi really quick in 95. But then actually I look back and Berger had a better qualifying record. So Alesi had some great peaks, and later in the season in particular, obviously everyone thinks of Monza, which was a race he could have won. But I think that just sort of sums up what you get with Alesi. You get these handful of drives which are fantastic or unbelievable, or even sometimes stints in Grand Prix that are brilliant. And then a lot of the rest of the time you're thinking, what are you actually doing? I wonder what could have been possible with him if he was in the right team environment earlier in his career. But Berger's probably the slightly more dependable one. But you want to put Berger alongside a young Charger, I think would have been the good option.
Well, this is it. This is why even 14-year-old me was sick of Alesi just teasing me by being good twice a year. And I was someone who'd always liked the kind of unreliable lunatic. I was a massive Montoya fan later on and stuff, and a massive Villeneuve fan early on. But no, even as a child, I just, like you say, Berger scored more points and was a dependable one, and Alesi was always just gonna break your heart if you took him too seriously.
Now, we briefly mentioned Johnny Herbert in the Benetton there, and there's actually a follow-up question we can attach to this, which comes from umpire Liam. So, Matt, Liam says, given that Johnny Herbert won 2 races in 95, and Alesi and Berger only won 1 race between them in 96 and 97 in competitive cars, should Benetton have actually kept Herbert and rewarded him for his performances in 95?
I think, Liam, you're just offering Herbert a load of mental torture there by suggesting it might have been a present, a rewarding present for him to stay on at Benetton. When Johnny talks about that Benetton year and a bit, it's so clear how quickly he became just so unsettled and so unhappy at that team, and so sick of the Flavio Briatore approach. Like even his 2 wins at Silverstone and Monza are all, they're tainted by the team reaction and Briatore's disinterest in him, all the paranoia over advantages Schumacher may or may not have been getting. Okay, that was the most competitive car of Johnny Herbert's F1 career, and it allowed him to win 2/3 of his races. But being there I don't think there was a single pleasurable second of his time there, really, and it did perceptions of him quite a lot of damage, even though he won 2 Grand Prix, including his home race there, because up until 95, he was this amazing talent in the terrible Lotus, and we never really knew what he was really going to be capable of. And then going into Benetton and being 2 seconds slower than Schumacher sometimes gave a false impression in a completely different way. We never really got to see what the actual kind of Herbert capability was. So I think the ideal reward for Johnny Herbert for everything he did in 95 was that Sauber became relatively good in 97 and let him have quite a relatively decent season with another podium.
I think the one thing, while I agree with everything Matt said there, the one advantage that keeping Herbert would have had for Benetton is because he'd struggled with that really pointy car that Schumacher worked well with, that Berger and Alesi struggled with. He might have helped one of those drivers understand a bit more what the problem was and help the team adapt the car to them a little bit more. But I think that's a minority argument, shall we say, and overall I think he was well out of there. But coming back to the pre-accident one, pre-accident Johnny Herbert and pre-accident Gerhard Berger, that would have been a good lineup for Benetton in 97, but that's very much in 96, that's very much a counterfactual version.
Well, that would have been a great lineup, definitely. I think I do get your point. I think 96 onwards, Herbert would have gotten better at Benetton with the staff lineup changing and that sort of thing, and the cars still being slightly competitive in the front running way. But I don't think he could have stayed at Benetton beyond 95 without basically stabbing Flavio Briatore at some point.
Yeah, I mean, we had Johnny on for that brilliant Lotus 94 episode, and at the end I said to him, like, thank you so much. I'm sorry we've just put you through an hour and a half of career torture. And I said, we'll have to talk about one of your wins in the future. And the first thing Johnny said was, well, even they weren't that enjoyable. And I think he signed off with one man's name comes to mind. And as Matt outlined there, that man is Flavio Briatore. Let's move on to a question from Tom Franks, who says, are there any liveries during the V10 era you think are underrated or underappreciated? And Tom says, I think the Williams 98 livery is very underrated and deserves some love. I understand why people dislike this livery, but I've always thought it was very smart. And I'll add here that even Patrick Head says the red Williamses of 98 and 99 were, in Patrick's words, a horrible colour. And he said it was made worse because red was always the colour of the team Williams had been trying to beat for so long. So, Ed, before you pick your own underrated livery, what did you think of Williams going red in 98?
Well, far be it from me to disagree with Patrick Head, although I have attempted it a few times in the past, which always leads to a lively discussion. But if he remembers, the first Williams Grand Prix engineering car, March for Patrick Nev in 1977, was red and white. So they weren't always not red, but certainly, while I preferred the previous Williams livery, the Rothmans livery, very coherent and striking and well, I didn't object to the Winfield red as much as others did. It looks a bit better from above, admittedly, from the side. I don't think it was a stunning livery. It probably deserves a little bit more appreciation than it got, but I don't think it's an all-time classic. But I was never militant about this colour change. It's just an interesting little move that Rothmans, the company, made. I think Winfield was their budget cigarette brand, wasn't it? So they wanted to try and push that much more in various markets in Europe. So yeah, not too offensive. It's an interesting one when it comes to underrated liveries, because there's loads of liveries that spring to mind, but it's that underrated.
Are they all LaRousses?
Well, I've got a lot of LaRousses on my list, actually. All the multicoloured LaRousses I like. I also like the 94 LaRousses, the Tortel Green, and the short-lived red and white Cronenberg one. Brilliant. My absolute favourite livery of this era is the Hugo Pratt Ligier that ran for 2 races at the end of 93, Martin Brundle's car, but obviously everyone remembers that livery and has posters of it on their walls. So For underrated, I'm starting my slightly lengthy story to it with the 94 Mile 7 Benetton, which is a green and blue livery that made a big impression on me at the time. I remember I got a 1:43 scale model of the B193 test car in that livery because it just looked really cool. But if you go on a decade forward, and what is ultimately an evolution of that livery, the Renaults late in the Bring Back V10s era, so let's say the 2005 Renault R25, Fernando Alonso's championship winning car, that kind of light blue and yellow, or turquoise and yellow, whatever you want to call it, was really striking and coherent. And for a more corporate era F1, the fact it was such a striking and coherent livery is actually quite rare. And I thought it was a shame when Alonso demoed that car. Everyone was talking about the noise for obvious reasons, but I don't remember anyone saying, "Oh, that was a great livery." So for such a high-profile car, the fact nobody talks about that livery as a good one, I think ticks the box of underrated.
I knew you were going to pick about 12 liveries in that question, but at least by your standards, you did it relatively quickly. But I agree with those Renaults. I thought they were gorgeous cars, and I don't know if it's just, I was going to say more time needs to pass, but 2005 was a long time ago. Maybe it's just that the sound is so good, as we've discussed so many times before. But Matt, what about you? Do you have a standout choice? And actually, before you do, I should mention that just last week we received a tweet from James Harvey, who used our Bring Back V10s hashtag in a post where he declared the, how shall I put this, vibrant 2000 Minardi as underrated. Now, Matt, I'm not going to ask you to comment on that unless it is your choice, but which one did you pick?
I do like that Minardi. I don't think that was hideous. I picked the genuinely gold Jordan in the first year of its Benson Hedges sponsorship. So I think from memory it started off quite yellow, and then 2 or 3 races in they went fully gold with it. And I still love that. I think that's really elegant and classy. And then it obviously went into the kind of snake's head and hornets and very yellow after that. And yeah, I know I like the full-on cigarette packet version from 96. I think that deserved a longer outing. On the subject of that late 93 Ligier, I did get a message from a friend when Williams unveiled its 2021 car with just a picture of that Ligier. And I was like, I don't think you're quite on the mark. And I wish Williams had gone for that Ligier livery instead this year, because it was really nice.
Yeah, quite. If you can't remember what that looked like, it's basically a sort of Ligier art car and quite easy to find, very distinctive. And it's a shame we don't get more quirky things like that. Shall I pick one for this? I'm going to go for, I'm also going for a Jordan. And I should say that if you want to hear more about Jordan's evolution of colours during that stage, Mark Gallagher, who worked for the team at the time, has talked about this quite a lot. And he has explained on his Twitter account why Jordan went through various stages of gold, yellow, and I think there was one that was called like the Desert Storm or something like that. And it was all to do with how it looked like on TV. And by the end of that yellow era, for a while, Jordan went sort of luminous, which didn't quite come across on TV, but it was all about making the colours much bolder. But I'm going to pick an earlier Jordan. I'm going for the blue Sasol Jordans, the 92, 93, 94 cars. I think that was a really gorgeous colour scheme. And the reason I think it's underrated or maybe gets overlooked is that obviously it followed the beautiful green Jordan 191, the team's first car. So probably going blue at the time after that green and blue car from the first year felt a bit underwhelming. But if you look at those cars in isolation, I think they're very good looking. But let's move on. And Ed, we've got a question from Ansi Rulamo, who says, how impressive was Stephane Sarrazin's sole F1 weekend in Brazil 1999? Did F1 miss something with him not getting another chance?
I'd say it was genuinely impressive. The chance came thanks to Luca Badoa breaking his hand in a testing crash at Fiorano. It was a fly-by-wire problem he had on his Minardi. They didn't have an obvious stand-in. They had Gaston Mazzucani as a test driver, but he wasn't super licensed. There were rumours about Shinji Nakano coming back, or Laurent Redon even, who tested a bit for Minardi and Benetton as well. But in the end, they got Sarrazin, who was the Prost test driver at the time, and he was racing an F3000 for the Prost Junior team, which was the Appomattox squad. And Sarrazin did do very well. He didn't test the car. He jumped into it on Friday, didn't fit in it that well because he was taller than the regulars. So it was straight in at the deep end, really. Had a big spin on the main straight on Friday in the wet, but he managed to get away with that. And he was quicker than Genet by the end of Friday. Qualified 19th, which became 17th when a few drivers got penalties. We have to add the caveat that Genet was only in his second Grand Prix weekend, so he wasn't exactly a veteran. And Sarrazin did have about 2,500 kilometres of testing under his belt for Prost, so he knew what to expect from an F1 car. But that was a really good effort. And the race went pretty well for as long as it lasted. He got ahead of Zanardi, but then had a brief off, lost a few places, picked his way back through. And then he had that very memorable, huge crash on the kind of kink on the main straight, the second one before the end of the straight, because that long haul up from the left-hander's got several kinks in it. So he piled into the barrier. Really memorable for those endless rotations he had after the impact.
It's a massive shunt.
Yeah, because he had a stuck throttle, which I think was a result of the impact rather than the cause. So he just went round and round and round in tyre smoke, which was spectacular. I think there was some kind of failure that was blamed for it, but the car was so heavily damaged, I don't think they ever got a definitive cause of that crash. But as for Sarrazin, he deserved a chance to make a bigger impact than that in F1. Obviously, different kind of impact, but ultimately he just kind of missed his chance. He caught the eye with that drive. His F3000 season then went decently, but not perfectly. Got a bit of a reputation for being a bit impatient in races. And then you had a driver like Nick Heidfeld who won the championship, and he was kind of the next cab off the rank for F1. And indeed, he got the Prost drive. Almost said Ligier there, slipping back in my V10s era. So yeah, he got the Prost drive instead. And then the 2000-3000 season didn't go very well. It's a very strange thing to say. The 2000-3000 season didn't go well for Sarrazin, and off he slid into sports cars with enormous success. Top sports car driver for a long time. I think he had a hat-trick of Le Mans pole positions, won the French Rally Championship even, and dabbled in WRC with Subaru. So a really, really good driver. Certainly could have in Formula One made a good career of it. I'm not going to say he was a lost champion, quick as he is, because not many drivers are capable of being champions. But I think with a few things going differently, maybe in F3000 he'd have been higher up people's lists. But what he did there was just one glimpse of what he might have been able to do as a decent Grand Prix driver.
And I would just say that the most impressive Sarrazin moment from the 3000 debut, wet dry race at Oschersleben, 18th on the grid to victory, upstaging Montoya and Heidfeld. That was his career high, and he probably could have stopped then apart from the whole Le Mans wins, couldn't he?
I love the fact that he did rallying as well, like proper rallying. Like, wasn't, we've seen something like Valentino Rossi do the occasional guest drive and this sort of thing, but yeah, Sarrazin was a proper Subaru driver, and I love that. But yeah, great driver. Shame he didn't get more of a chance. Matt, we've got a question from Thomas who says, what if the wrong person brought the Drivers' Championship back to Maranello in 1999 for Ferrari? Obviously that meaning Eddie Irvine. Would that have impacted Michael Schumacher's legacy, as he didn't do the job he set out to achieve in bringing the glory back to Ferrari? So if Irvine had got over the line in 99 after Schumacher broke his leg, Matt, would that have been a problem for Schumacher and Ferrari?
I think it would have been hilarious. I don't think it would have been a problem for Schumacher and Ferrari long term. The hilarity for me comes from the idea of Eddie Irvine taking the number one to Jaguar for 2000 and having that disaster of a season as reigning world champion. I think that would have put an even bigger spotlight on Jaguar going wrong in F1. I think but it would have been seen by history as an anomaly if it had been Irvine who got that Ferrari title over the line. The weight of Schumacher's contribution to make Ferrari respectable again by then was already enormous. It would have been clear to the watching world that Schumacher would have won that. If Irvine had won that title, then Schumacher would have won it by a mile without breaking his leg. And everything that happened in 2000 to 2004 would still have happened. And that was what really cemented the kind of Schumacher and Ferrari era. So yeah, it would be an interesting curiosity with amusing Jaguar consequences, but we'd still be talking about Schumacher in exactly the same way.
Yeah, I'd never actually considered the fact that Irvine would have been running the number one on the Jaguar. I love that. But I think Ferrari got an outcome that they found acceptable. They won their first Constructors' Championship in ages, and they got to just wait a year for Schumacher to win the first one. So I think the first driver's title, I think they were pretty happy with that. But let's stick with Schumacher's absence in 99, Ed, because one of our reviewers, Brundu, said, how would it have affected the rest of the V10 era and all that dominance Matt just mentioned if Schumacher hadn't come back after that 1999 crash?
Very, very interesting question. Obviously, the key question is, who is then Ferrari's driver for this period where they won so many championships, and would they have been so successful? So if you're looking at the available drivers, you need a World Championship caliber driver. Not many of those around at the best of times. This era probably wasn't the absolute best of times in that regard. So who do you get? Mika Hakkinen, hard to get him out of McLaren. I guess maybe a bit later he might have liked the idea of a switch to Ferrari to revitalise that enthusiasm. Probably not, though. They showed interest in David Coulthard before, but why do you want the guy who's been beaten by Mika Hakkinen? Heinz-Harald Frentzen having a good season for Jordan, but do you really want the guy who failed at Williams? Although, given what we've talked about before, I'm sure Eddie Jordan would have found a way to convince them they needed Frentzen and sell him for $100 million or something. So, I think looking at the chessboard of all the drivers, you have to look at the guy who's a world champion, driving around in an uncompetitive car, not scoring any points. And this is going to make you very excited, Glenn. And I think you settle on Jacques Villeneuve. They've got the financial clout to get him out, even of a team that was built around him. And Bernie Ecclestone would certainly have wanted the Villeneuve name in a Ferrari now that they'd lost their Schumacher star name. So what do you reckon to that, Glenn?
Well, I think you've just bought yourself a ticket to every single Bring Back V10s episode there's ever going to be, especially after the rocky start Matt gave us to this episode. We've gone from Villeneuve not winning the 97 championship to driving a Ferrari and inevitably winning the next 5 world championships, just as Schumacher did.
It's a really interesting question as to how much Villeneuve would have succeeded in Ferrari. Does it mean that downstream that Williams would have won a title, say, in 2003, perhaps? Or could Kimi Räikkönen have won that title instead if Villeneuve wasn't quite at the level of Schumacher? So it's really interesting. Would the Ferrari era have happened if they didn't have Schumacher, given the relative lack of drivers around? And what impact could that have had particularly on Williams and maybe even on the overall success of a team like McLaren? Could they have eked out a few more championships from the early part of the 21st century? Will we now be talking about the McLaren era for whatever reason? Would David Coulthard have picked up a championship or another championship or two for Mika Hakkinen? Really interesting to imagine whether Ferrari could have happened without Michael Schumacher, and I'm not sure it necessarily would have done. Not because the team wasn't very, very good, but could Villeneuve do what Schumacher did? Villeneuve was very good, and he was still very good at this point. I'm not sure he could quite deliver in the same way, though.
I certainly think Hakkinen might have stuck around longer if Schumacher hadn't been there. I think it would have been easier for Hakkinen to get that second wind and kind of come back to his best after pushing himself so hard for those first titles. I love the idea of Villeneuve in a Ferrari, especially at this point. I thought Villeneuve from like 98 to 2000 with the less good Williams and the very difficult early BARs was magic to watch. But I do feel like that was a time when Villeneuve was at his best in against the odds situations and going into a Ferrari that should have been dominating up against a pretty quick teammate in Barrichello as well, it would have been. I can't see that being 5 years of consecutive Villeneuve success, but Glenn, I'll admit that Villeneuve would have had more championships than he has got if he'd driven for Ferrari in the early 2000s.
How many championships has he got, Glenn, in this alternative reality?
Well, what year are we in now? 2021, so he'd still be there, and the cars would have all been perfect. So, yeah, I mean, he'd have won every championship in the 21st century so far. I think that's a given. We obviously, this is the rest of the episode now, is mapping out Jacques Villeneuve at Ferrari. Being serious, I'm not entirely sure it would have been an amazing fit, and I actually think that the whole going to the team where your dad's entire F1 legacy lies wouldn't have been a great fit for him either. I always got the impression that Jacques railed against that a bit in his younger years. I put that to him a few years ago, and he demoed one of Gilles' cars at the Canadian Grand Prix. And I said to him, is this the sort of thing that you maybe weren't so into when you were younger, and now you've got more of an appreciation of it? And he kind of danced around it. So I think there's a lot of things about going to Ferrari that he probably would have hated. And let's be honest, would he have been the relentless winning machine that Michael Schumacher was? Would he have been that vital cog that the whole team was built around, and that, you know, everybody spun off of Schumacher's brilliance, and that's what drove everybody to work so hard under Jean Todt and Ross Brawn. Ferrari wouldn't have had that early 2000s magic in the same way. They still had good cars. They were on the right track by then. He definitely won races and, yeah, hopefully a championship or two. But I also don't think he'd have been there as long as Schumacher. So we would then get into the realms of who else would have been driving and winning for Ferrari in the early and mid 2000s. But yeah, I'm worried that we are now, it's like Ed talking about Larousse. We're going to be stuck on this subject for the rest of the episode. Okay, I've got all the Villeneuve out of my system for this episode and for this series. Ed, we've got a question from Ronster84 who says, Which car do you most wish had been given the opportunity to change the fortunes of a team but never got to race? Ronster says, for me, the Prost AP05 was rumoured to be something special, but Prost folded before it had the chance to race. There are photos of the wind tunnel model, and you can find those with a quick Google, and it looks great. Are there any others that were mothballed and never saw the light of day that you would have liked to see?
Yeah, that AP05 is an interesting case. It does have a big reputation, but there's never as competitive a car as one that never races, is there? It's a bit like the Toyota after they pulled out was going to be absolutely brilliant in 2010. But yeah, you do wonder. And actually, in the case of that Prost, Henri Durand had a big part to play in that car. And we should remember that a lot of the principles and ideas he did later take to Jordan, which I don't think worked especially well. So there's a big asterisk against that one. But it would be nice to see the car put to the test. Although, even if the car was as good as it's rumoured to be, which I doubt, I don't think that team, if it had survived, would have been in a position to exploit it very well anyway. So, yeah, I doubt we would have seen a great deal from it. But in terms of car, I'm going to go for a car package. And I would have liked to see, and we talked about this on Bring Back V10s before, the McLaren Lamborghini. Now, we saw the car. They tested with the Lamborghini engine. It was quite promising. We've got all sorts of doubts about what Lamborghini's overall commitment would have been. And I'm not sure it would have been quite as good as hoped. But the chance for that engine to show what it could do, maybe for the Lamborghini name to actually achieve something in Formula One, which obviously it never has beyond the odd half-decent result with midfield teams in that era. So I'd have loved to have seen Senna in a McLaren Lamborghini, or probably if it had been running the Lamborghini engine in '94, then we'd have been talking about a different driver in it. But yeah, I just like the sound of that, McLaren Lamborghini, so I'm just going to keep saying it.
Well, obviously, Martin Brundle ended up racing for McLaren the following year, and he talked about this either during recent F1 testing or the Bahrain Grand Prix weekend in one of his commentaries. And he said that Senna tried to get McLaren to run Lamborghini engines in the last couple of races of the year. So Senna did want to race that car before he left for Williams. His mind was already made up by then. He was going to Williams. And as we've discussed in the past, Ron, I think, always claimed that he thought he could get Senna after the Williams deal had been announced. He could get Senna to change his mind, but Senna said it wasn't about works engines. It was about quite simply going and driving what he thought was going to be a great Williams. I'm going to make a pick here, and it's not a car that would have changed the fortunes of anyone, but it is a car that never got to race. I always wanted to see the Dome, the Japanese car that tested a lot in the mid-90s, and we gave them a brief mention in our Lola episode because they were a team sensible enough to see that they didn't have enough money to do it, and that car never got to race. But let's move on, Ed. We've already talked about Ligier a few times in this episode, and you've got another chance now because there's a question from Joe Taylor who says, how did Ligier survive the early 90s and maintain sponsorship despite building a succession of terrible cars where other experienced teams like Lotus and Brabham fell apart and promising newcomers like March and Scuderia Italia failed to gain traction? So Ed, you're in heaven here just by the teams mentioned there. But let's start with the Ligier point. Is Joe's question fair? You know, were Ligier lucky to get through a period where they weren't very competitive?
Yeah, I think it's a very pertinent question, and it reflects the fact that Ligier had one very big advantage in that it was the focal point for France. So loads of French companies involved, constant attempts to turn it into the French national team. And that's how it came to get Renault engines in 93, for example. It often had backing from the French lottery. So decent funding. Companies like Elf, Gaulois kept it stable, although we did see them have to concede a little bit when they took on a driver like Pedro Diniz with his backing. It also had that history stretching back a long way. Now, Lotus was mentioned as a counterpoint. But, of course, the UK had McLaren, Williams, Benetton, so they could afford to lose Lotus from that perspective. So there wasn't the political support for that. And you can, if you listen to that episode with Johnny Herbert earlier in this series, episode 8, I think it was, you can hear about the decline of Lotus. But Ligier just had this extra foundation to get industry involved in France. And even then, Guy Ligier had to sell on the team to Cyril Derouf before it was bought by Briatore and Walkinshaw. So even then, it wasn't surviving that well. And that French national dream did come true when Prost acquired the team and got the Peugeot engines down the line, but it all went well. But the unique position as the French team helped it enormously and stopped it going the same way as one of my favourites, Larousse, which couldn't attract any of that. And there are other French teams around, AGS, for example, in the Bring Back V10s era that just couldn't get the money involved. So Ligier had some big advantages. And I think in that respect, it actually was a great underachiever because it could have stood on its own 2 feet because it had certain advantages that simply were not capitalised on.
Matt, we've got a question from Rory Goodson, who says, Mika Hakkinen has talked previously about the prospect of him and Michael Schumacher being teammates in 1996. Mika thinks it would have been very close. What do you think?
96 is a key element of that because that is not Mika Hakkinen at his absolute finest. If you're talking Hakkinen at his best versus Schumacher at his best, Hakkinen probably faster if outright sheer one lap pace. But 96, Hakkinen has admitted that was after his massive crash at Adelaide at the end of 95. He was in a coma with a fractured skull. It was a very serious, life-threatening situation. Just 4 months later, he was back in an F1 car. When he talks about it mentally, I think you believe when he says it didn't affect him from a kind of fear and confidence point of view, but it did take an enormous physical toll in terms of training, in terms of how much it allowed him to focus mentally on everything, being a Grand Prix driver involved. He reckons it was 98 before he was really back to full strength, and he's talked about being quite unnerved by the arrival of David Coulthard at McLaren for 96 because there was going to be an aggressive young charger up against him when he was in this kind of compromised state. Him and Coulthard didn't get on very well, particularly at the start as well. So, sadly, I think if Schumacher and Hakkinen ended up together at McLaren specifically in 96, that could have been a real blow to Hakkinen's F1 reputation because it wouldn't have been a fair reflection of how good he actually was. But when you compare them at their best, I think Hakkinen would have got under Schumacher's skin as a teammate just through his sheer speed and his straightforward attitude and his kind of no-nonsense approach to the kind of blurred driving standard ethics that Schumacher liked to play with, as we really famously saw at Spa in 2000, which Hakkinen talked about so beautifully on Bring Back V10s himself. That was like where the line between how they were both willing to race was really drawn. I think that under the same roof in one team would have been just incredible and explosive, and I've got no idea who would have come out on top because it would have put Schumacher on the back foot in a way that no teammate ever did. Also, this question did make me think about how much in the mid-90s it was taken as fact almost for a while that Schumacher would go to McLaren because McLaren had Mercedes engines and that sports car relationship would be revived. And I made a mental note that we should talk about that one day and Bring Back V10s.
Yeah, we definitely will. The whole saga around Schumacher and being the linchpin of that driver market at the time. But I agree with you. I think the fact that we're talking about 96 does make us lean towards Schumacher there. I think that you really saw Hakkinen become the driver that he would be in 98 through 97. He got stronger and stronger and obviously should have won some races that he lost because the car blew up. Just going very quickly back to the Ligier and Prost thing, we get quite a few questions from our listeners about when are we going to talk about Prost? Can we do an episode on Prost? There are so many stories. We are going to do more than one episode about Prost in the future. I promise you. The story of that team and its relatively short existence and how much Alain hated doing it in the end is worth plenty of episodes down the line. So don't worry about that. And yeah, as Matt said there, I think Schumacher ending up at Ferrari and where else he could have gone is an episode of its own as well. But Ed, let's move on. We've got a question from Konstantin Golotta, who says, what was the story behind Williams failing to file on time to participate in the 1993 season and requiring consent from all the other teams to be let back in?
Well, the question pretty much sums it up there. It was a simple paperwork error. The reigning champion team failed to get its entry in time, which is a bit comedy, although I'm no fan of paperwork myself, so I've got a small amount of sympathy, but there would have been someone whose job it was to get that in, and it would be one of those stupid oversights. And realistically, there was never any chance Williams wouldn't be allowed to compete because the FIA is not going to shut them out, but the mistake was that it gave the FIA a little bit of leverage over them, even if it was fairly trivial leverage. And there was always the gap at the top of the entry list for numbers 1 and 2, or numbers 0 and 2, as it actually was in 93, given Mansell wasn't around. Benetton and Minardi were the ones who were blocking it, partly out of mischief and partly because there was all sorts of political wrangling going on regarding the regulations, both for that season and for driver aids in the future. So it's part of that wider landscape. It's not quite as simple as Williams had to agree to driver aid bans to be let in, because obviously the driver aids thing rumbled on for quite a long time, and it wasn't really resolved until the middle of that year for the following year, after everyone had been declared, well, everyone apart from Scuderia Italia, of course, was declared illegal at Canada for running driver aids that season. But it was just a stupid political error that meant Williams was just slightly weakened in its dealings with the governing body, which is never a nice position to be in. And actually, it probably reflects a weakness of Williams in general, that it wasn't always the best at playing the political game. Ferrari was particularly good at that, you would say, during that period. So, yeah, stupid mistake. Didn't make much difference in the end, but certainly made their life a bit more uncomfortable when it came to the talking shop elements of Grand Prix racing.
Our next question is from Windmill David, who left us a 5-star review. Thank you very much for that, David. And Matt, you can take this one, because the question is, how did Juan Pablo Montoya end up at McLaren? Surely a clash of attitudes that was always destined to end up as it did, of course, with Montoya leaving the team after about a season and a half and just walking away and doing NASCAR. So, Matt, was this always doomed?
Yes. And it was obviously always doomed at the time. And it made no sense at the time, other than this was the era of Ron Dennis being some kind of mischievous magpie mood and trying to sign key rivals' best drivers at inopportune moments to upset and destabilise them, as he did with poaching Alonso from Renault in another deal done over a season in advance. Which was just a little bit of a hobby he had at the time almost. When this happened, Ron and Montoya as well made a big deal of the McLaren Senna success and the kind of potential parallels there with another quick South American driver coming to McLaren. But Montoya was never Senna. Montoya was explosively talented, but all that kind of direction and focus that you got with Senna wasn't there. There just wasn't a realistic comparison that anyone should have ever made. And to be basing so much of this deal on the fact that Senna achieved so well at McLaren, Montoya was a Senna fan, Montoya is also South American, therefore this will be magic. No, it was madness, really. And you wouldn't have predicted that it would have fallen apart so spectacularly with Montoya's tennis-ish injury at the start of 2005, kind of setting the tone for the relationship, and then him walking out, or being sort of walking out, deciding he was going to NASCAR, and then McLaren helping him quickly out of the exit door to replace him with Pedro de la Rosa for the rest of the 2006 season. I wouldn't have seen that coming, but even as a Montoya fan back then, I thought Williams and the kind of spiky but competitive Frank and Patrick atmosphere, that is the right place to get the best out of Montoya. Of course, the door was only open for McLaren to snatch him because things were so spiky at Williams at that time. Ron Dennis pounced after Williams and Montoya had a falling out over who got pit stop priority at the 2003 French Grand Prix with Montoya and Ralf Schumacher. And that was at a time when Williams hadn't kind of got properly on the pace in 2003 either. That was when their really competitive run started. So no, I wish Montoya had stayed put for the sake of his own reputation, even though Williams was on a bit of a downward trend from then onwards. McLaren plus Montoya was never going to work. Didn't see it ending with a mid-season sacking and switch to NASCAR, though. That was certainly a shock.
Right, we're into the final stretch then for this episode and, of course, for the series. And Ed, let's have a question about V10 engines, shall we? JJ Cooper asks, what was the best engine of the era? And maybe more interestingly, and I think, Ed, this more up your street, what was the worst? So which one do you want to take first?
Well, I'll go with the best first, get that one out of the way. It's actually quite an interesting question because there were various periods of engine dominance, but when thinking about the best, I tried to work out which was the one that maybe advanced the breed most aggressively. And I ended up hitting on the Mercedes engines of the late 90s because this was Ilmer, of course, who was doing those engines. Huge amount of innovation in terms of the materials they were using. Great performance levels, using things like beryllium alloy, low density, lightweight material, great thermal characteristics that just allowed them to produce an engine that was more powerful than what Ferrari did. And indeed, it took Mercedes quite a long time to recover from when beryllium, for example, was outlawed, to get back to similar power levels. So this was the point when they were really a step ahead, I would say, because not many other teams were experimenting with these kind of materials, and a lot of those that did were having quite big problems with it. So yeah, I'd go with the late 90s Mercedes run of engines. As for the worst, it has to be the Life W12, doesn't it? It's remembered as terrible. It was unreliable, way down on power. It probably had about 3/4 of the power of the next worst engine on the grid. Just nowhere near. And it didn't go for more than about a lap at the best at the times anyway. And the really funny thing is that whole Life F1 project was about the engine. Ernest Vita, who had the rights to the engine, Vita means life in Italian, hence the name, he tried to sell it to a proper team previously and then thought, oh, no one wants my brilliant engine, so we'll showcase it in our own team and it'll be brilliant and everyone will want it. But of course it just turned out to be a massive comedy operation. I'm just going to throw in an honourable mention though to a Bring Back V10s favourite, because while the Life ultimately was always going to be a disaster, that Porsche engine that was used by Footwork in 1991, the one that everyone wanted, we've talked previously about all sorts of teams chasing it, it was just terrible. It was high cost, it was obsolete technology, terrible, heavy. It was just a bit like the Life engine, only a bit better, should we say, for what it was, a Porsche F1 engine that should have been so good. It was absolutely awful. So pound for pound, perhaps the Porsche edges the Life, because Porsche really should have known better.
More than one type of pound there as well, because it was so heavy. I'm going to very quickly say the best one for me, and this is an emotive answer, was the Renault. It defined the 90s and took us on to the next level that Ed mentioned, where Mercedes raised their game, and then Ferrari and BMW and everything we saw that was so brilliant about the 2000s, I think, came about as a result of the steps that Renault took. In the 90s, worst one of the era. Well, Gary Anderson always tells us how bad the original Yamaha engine was that Jordan was saddled with in 92. So I'll go with that. Obviously, what we saw from Yamaha with some sort of Brian Hart influence later in the era was a bit more respectable. But that early one was dreadful. But let's move on. We've got another hypothetical from John Butcher. And Matt, you can take this one. John says, if Imola 94 hadn't happened, would Ayrton Senna have won titles in 94 and 97 and been the first 7-time world champion? Or would we have seen him in a Ferrari in 1996?
I can't see Schumacher beating Senna in both 94 and 95. I think the level Schumacher was at, and the fact that Williams came into 94 a little bit destabilised and wasn't perfect in 95, even with Senna on board, it wouldn't have been enough to get Williams over the line in both those years, probably one of them. But the big unknown about this is all those Schumacher disqualifications and the ban and everything that basically added up to okay, we know Schumacher really beat Hill by 1 point in 94. You assume Senna would have outscored Hill by more than 1 point, therefore Senna wins that title. But yeah, it's the unknown of all the disqualifications. Schumacher lost potentially 30 points worth of, more than that, with Silverstone too, 36, 40 even, 40 points, settle on 40.
All
40
the
points
points.
worth
He lost all the points.
Yeah, he lost a lot of points. Maybe he'd have got disqualified even more because Senna would have pushed for more probes into Benetton sooner for different things. It would become an even bigger political story. But no, I don't think he'd have won every single title of that period. And I also don't think, even if Schumacher had been beating Senna to titles, I don't think the Senna-Williams relationship would have been over that quickly. I think given the respect both parties had for each other and having seen each other take so much success apart, I think Ferrari would have still been the team that ended up with Schumacher for 96. Senna might never have got his dream ending of retiring after a Ferrari season because Schumacher would have been sat in the way there. So it would have changed history, definitely. But yeah, that wouldn't have been a Senna title run, sadly, had he lived.
Yeah, I've always thought Senna would have ended up in a Ferrari at some point, just because the magnetic pull of the two names meant they had to come together at some point. And as we've briefly discussed in the past, Senna and Ferrari always had talks, and you just think that they would have ended up there at some point. But I think you're right, Matt, that Schumacher ending up there and a few more years of Schumacher and Senna feuding by that point would mean that there's no way you'd end up with them in the same team. So we'll have to come back to that one. Maybe we'll revisit that in our Schumacher-Ferrari episode in the future and work out what on earth would have happened to Senna if he was still around. Now, Ed, Clay Halford picks you out specifically because Clay says 1 for Ed. And the question is, unsurprisingly, which of the pre-qualifying teams that lasted a few seasons had the best potential to become a contender a la Jordan? And Clay says, I've got a soft spot for Onyx and Simtech myself.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree on Onyx, actually, simply because of what the team did achieve. They got a podium finish.
I love Onyx as well.
And from a technical and team organisation perspective under Michael, it did have real potential. They had things well together. The disadvantage was they had a or even rather erratic owner in Jean-Pierre Van Rossum. And ultimately, when he pulled out, that pulled the rug from under the team. In fact, Van Rossum was really frustrated that he didn't get that Porsche engine we talked about. So perhaps things wouldn't have gone so well for Onyx had Van Rossum stayed involved if they got the Porsche. But very often, these teams had good people in them. They just didn't have the cash to a greater or lesser degree. But Onyx was probably the one that showed the best possibility. Should we say Simtech? I did quite like, and it's worth remembering that 95 car showed some flashes of promise. Jos Verstappen, I think, qualified 14th in Argentina and ran in the top 6 for a few laps before retiring. So it wasn't without merit, but it never really had the funding, and I'm not totally sure Nick Worth was the right guy technically to head up a team. I think he had some great lofty ideas and did come up with some great innovations, but I think he lacked perhaps what Jordan had in Gary Anderson, who obviously you have to declare an interest there, know him well, and he's the race's technical expert. But Gary Anderson has a great practical connection to racing cars, shall we say, which I think really helped Jordan. So I actually don't think any of those teams had that magical combination of the entrepreneurial spirit of Eddie Jordan, who could sell ice to the Eskimos and probably literally did at some stage. I'm sure one day he'll come out with a book that talks about that particular thing. And then the practicality of Gary Anderson and some of the other people involved. But yeah, Onyx is the one that probably deserved a chance to show what it can do with a firm foundation, because it had so many good people involved. But that's not to say others didn't. But a team like, say, Coloni was always struggling so much to get anywhere. It never really had a chance.
Yeah, I'd totally agree on the Onyx front as well. I think a lot of pre-qualifying teams really were there through incompetence as much as lack of funding, and Onyx was a clear example of something that could have done something with a bit more stability and less madness around it. On that Simtech point, I do think Simtech often gets a free pass through being so purple, for one thing, but also it's almost like an unraced car, because the team fell out of F1 just after those quite promising early 95 races. So you never really knew if that sort of hint of success could have been sustained. And, we all got excited about Nick Worth's ideas at that time. But as Ed pointed out, when Nick Worth was tested in different environments, a lot of those ideas just lacked the practicality to actually be successful in F1. So I suspect if Simtech had lasted, say, 3 seasons, it would have been remembered as a nice colour scheme, but a failed team rather than this kind of tantalising could have been that it's often referred to as now.
It was a very purple question, wasn't it? We just spent most of our time talking about Onyx and Simtech. But let's move on to the final question of the series, and another chance to end another series talking about kart, or IndyCar, as some of you may remember it from the time. IndyCart asks, when Paul Tracy tested for Benetton, which was in 1994, how did it go? Why didn't he race for them in 95? And if he had raced for them, how do you think he would have done? So I'm going to give us a bit of context here. So let's revisit how Tracy did at the test, because it's quite often remembered and told by Paul that he did a time good enough for 4th on the grid at the Portuguese Grand Prix. And this was in the post-race test at Estoril. And that is true. But a lot of people went faster in the test than they did on the race weekend. And Tracy was 9th fastest at the test, which matched the time of Jos Verstappen in the Benetton as well. And they were both around a second down on Michael Schumacher. Now, Ross Brawn said at the time, Paul did a very professional job. Considering he was new to the car, the circuit and F1, his time was very creditable. I saw nothing to say he couldn't hold his own in F1. He may not be as quick as Michael, but he's at the upper end of the scale and has lots of potential. And there was some brilliant Flavio Briatore fun and games before this test even happened, because Flavio tried to get Tracy to sign a 3-year contract, which had no guarantee of anything more than a test driver deal, but also meant Tracy couldn't race for anyone else in F1 during that time, and Briatore would become his manager. And Flavio said to Tracy, who'd already flown to Portugal by this point, if you don't sign this, you're not getting in the car. Bernie Ecclestone then intervened and basically barked at Flavio to sort it out and to get Tracy in the car, because Bernie had set up the test in the first place. And they came to an agreement where Benetton would get first refusal on Tracy in F1, but nothing more than that. So, Matt, we obviously know that this didn't happen, and Tracy went on to race in America for many more years and eventually win a title in 2003. Do you think F1 missed out on Paul Tracy, and how do you think he would have done if he had come over at that time?
I think this question is basically, did F1 need a cross between Jean Alesi and Juan Pablo Montoya in terms of attitude, approach, but also ability and inconsistency all together? It would have been a great story. It would have been really fun, but I can't imagine him actually achieving much in F1. It does say a lot that Tracy's IndyCar kart title finally came in 2003 when there wasn't a great deal of opposition around. He was at Penske for so long. He had a spell at Newman Haas. He had a spell at Team Green, and it's in some really competitive seasons. Didn't win a championship. Probably has some kind of record for number of collisions with teammates through the course of his career. On balance, you'd say after his years alongside Dario Franchitti that Dario was the better driver, the better package, and he didn't make it to F1, which is another story. It would have been hugely entertaining had Tracy come into F1. I don't think there's been a lot of success. I can't see it lasting much longer than Michael Andretti's time in F1 would have done. Although I do think Tracy was quicker than Andretti in terms of raw pace. I think it's best left as a might have been. It is also really interesting how much F1 was trying to get the top IndyCar stars over at that time as well, because there's talks of Alonso Jr. being linked with F1 deals. Villeneuve obviously made it. Ecclestone getting involved in Paul Tracy's career seems bizarre now, but it did happen. But I think that's a compliment to how strong IndyCar was becoming, rather than the sign that Paul Tracy was a massive lost F1 talent. But we definitely missed out on some fireworks.
I completely agree with Matt there. Paul Tracy was a very good driver, but I think for him to be a success in F1, he probably needed to be born 12, 15 years earlier, and then he might actually have worked quite well. I can see him working in the turbo era, but the way motorsport was going, Formula One in particular at that time, I don't think he's that well suited to it. And if Michael Andretti couldn't quite get his head around it, I doubt Paul Tracy would have been able to, even though he did have a decent level of ability. But different drivers have different skill sets and mentalities that work in different places. So I certainly don't think in retrospect he'd like to have swapped the career he had in IndyCar style racing, to use the generic term, for a go at F1, because I don't think it would have worked, and it probably would just deprived him some of his better years in kart when it was at its best.
Some of his more lucrative years as well. I think he made some good money during that career. I think Paul Tracy in F1, for however long it would have lasted, would have been incredibly entertaining. As Matt says, probably not much success, but yeah, I kind of agree that it'd be a bit like Montoya on something, shall we say. It'd have been brilliantly entertaining. He wouldn't have held back. He'd have, Tracy's always been someone who's spoken his mind throughout his career. But if you look back at a lot of the things Tracy has said, there's a really interesting story, and we really are going into Bring Back kart territory here. When Penske went a bit rubbish and Tracy was still there, he told Roger Penske, if you get me a Reynard chassis, a Honda engine and Firestone tyres, I'll win you the championship. Shortly after that, he got fired by Penske. And then went to Team Green, who did have a Reynard chassis, a Honda engine and Firestone tyres, and basically wasn't as good as Dario Franchitti, as we've just said, and certainly didn't win a championship in it. But again, that's a great example of the type of personality Paul was, and I would have really liked to see him come into F1 and go up against some of those, the drivers of that era. I mean, Paul Tracy having F1 run-ins and collisions with Michael Schumacher, if he could get near him, Jacques Villeneuve, Juan Pablo Montoya, all of that, yes please, sign me up.
He's also one of about 1,000 drivers in this era who you could make a case for being brilliant based on a performance in a post-race test at Estoril where they were really, really fast. The track conditions had improved so much after a race weekend that everyone was doing this. This is why Michael Andretti's always on pole by 2 seconds, theoretically, a few days after the race weekend happens.
Well, and as we discussed earlier in this series, the only car I think that's ever gone slower in that post-race Estoril test, until they took all the wings off it, as Johnny Herbert told us, was the Lotus. So that was how bad that car was. That didn't apply at all. But yeah, this era when there was so much testing is littered with stories of so-and-so did a time that was absolutely brilliant, and he probably did it with no fuel, special tyres at 5:30 in the evening when the sun's gone down and the track's rubbered in and nice and cool. So a classic story there. And that's why the context is always so important, because it's easy to remember, Paul Tracy would have been 4th on the grid, when actually the story is he was 9th at the test and as quick as Verstappen, which in itself, given he'd never driven an F1 car or been to Estoril before, is quite interesting. Now, if we go on for any longer, we are going to end up in a Bring Back Kart episode. But if classic IndyCar stories are your thing, look out for the Race IndyCar podcast, which is new for 2021. And between its episodes covering the modern day goings on in America, there will be time for some detailed revisiting of classic tales from US racing's heyday. I know they've already recorded one incredible classic story episode, which I think is going to run next month, but I won't spoil the surprise of what that's going to be. But that's another series of Bring Back V10s in the books. Thanks to everyone that submitted questions and reviews, and sorry if we couldn't get to yours this time. There will of course be a fourth series later in the year, but we don't yet have a launch date for that. And the main reason for that is that all the research notes for this series, and I counted them up yesterday, came to 155,000 words in the end. So that is why I don't commit to a start date, because there's so much work involved. I have no idea when I'm going to fit all of that in. But let's say the summer, shall we, for a comeback and for Series 4. Because with so many of you listening to the show, interacting with us, leaving reviews, questions, and everything else that we get from you, Bring Back V10s will keep returning for many more series in the future. Until then, revisit our old episodes if there's any you haven't got to yet. Check out our website, therace.com, and as Ed always says, don't forget the hyphen. Follow @WeAreTheRace on social media, and make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel, where we put out multiple videos a week, including a few that look back at F1's rich history. If you need a bit of Edge Straw audio in your life on a weekly basis, make sure you listen to the Race F1 podcast, where Ed is the host. But for now, I'm off to do all the other parts of my job that have been on hold for the last 3 months, but it won't be long, I promise, before the research starts all over again for Series 4.